Absolute End is an absolute failure in storytelling. There are no words in the English language to describe my complete and utter disdain for this episode. Despite episode 7 ending being a near perfect setup for the finale, Absolute End somehow found a way to completely undermine everything that's been so meticulously set up over the 3 years the show is in production. It might have great visuals and entertaining moments, but the writing quality of this episode is nothing short of abysmal, and I'm tired of the fandom praising this gilded heap of fecal matter as if it was Christ himself on a stick. There was a time in which I thought this episode was okay by itself, but not at all a good ending to the series. However, upon analyzing it further and deconstructing the plot and its implications on the rest of the narrative, I've come to the conclusion that this episode is a complete and utter failure in storytelling in almost every way possible. Now, if I had to pin down a few key things that make this episode a failure in storytelling, it would be among these three: lackluster characterization, retcons and plot holes, and of course, nullification of major narrative consequences. Each of these three are interlinked to create one of the most shallow, insulting, and disrespectful series finales the show could have possibly ended with, that goes out of its way to curb stomp the life out of murder drones, and completely destroys the narrative that's been leading up to this episode. Starting off with characterization, and arguably one of the most controversial aspects of this episode, even among its own fans, Jay. Remember her confidence? Remember her loyalty to JC Jensen and Tessa? Remember her hatred of Sin? Gone. Now she's basically just a carbon copy of V from the earlier half of the series without any of the nuance that made V's arc work. V being aware of what happened was hinted at early on in the series and shaped most of the choices she made from that point forward, all for the sake of keeping herself and N alive. But here Jay is just straight up serving Sin, only because she's scared of her, effectively making her confidence nothing more than a facade, and consequently retcons her previously established loyalty to humans. Not only was Jay being aware never hinted at in any episode she appeared in, there's actually evidence that indicates she wasn't. It's very brief, but in episode 6 we see Sin disguised as Tessa give Jay an order to prepare their ship, to which she briefly gives her and the others a concerned glance before flying off. Why would she give them this glance if she already knew that the plan was to blow up the planet? Her prior relationship with Tessa ultimately meant nothing in the end, because her death had no consequences. So they basically just brutally killed off the only friend Jay ever had, and threw away an arc ripe with character development just to make Sin look more scary. We also have another character wasted too, N. He straight up has no reaction to Uzi's death at the end of the previous episode, and somehow knew she was in space, which, by the way, is never explained, nor how Uzi and Nori ended up there in the first place. The little crowd drawing he gave Jay pretty much exemplifies how little of an impact her getting dragged away had on him. Episode 7 was probably N's best episode, because there's a significant amount of time in which he's an actual character who's pushed to his limits, rather than being a lapdog to Uzi. But here they're pretty much together for the whole thing and are only briefly separated a couple times, before reuniting before and after the final battle. To totally nail into your head how wasted he was, there could have been an interaction with Jay where he tells her Sin killed Tessa, and we could have shown Jay having an emotional reaction or outright denying it, and blaming it all on him, causing a fight to break out. Essentially, we would replace the Oil Rose fight with an N and J fight, and I think this would have been a great opportunity to show major development in both of them. Unfortunately, however, this never came to pass in the actual episode. Now we have to rely on literal fan fiction to show us how their arcs could have gone. Alright, so who's next to dissect like a lab rat? Well, it's quite hard to do that with Uzi or any of the side characters, as they basically don't do anything significant until the final battle. As good as episodes 6 and 7 were, a major issue in both of them is that Uzi had next to no agency, and the few decisions she did make were either very small or redundant. That's not exactly good for the main character of your story now, is it? She's basically just Sin's little play toy in both those episodes, with the few moments of autonomy she has not being significant for her character. Also, I'm gonna be completely blunt here, the newsy scenes are just fan service and don't contribute anything to the story. I think them simply hugging or comforting each other would have been good enough. We don't need to be outright told that they're just dating now, especially with everything else that's going on currently. Speaking of Sin, she's only really as dangerous as the plot really allows her to be. We've seen her easily overpower Uzi and N twice by herself, and yet during the final battle, Uzi essentially just beating the shit out of her with no help from the disassembly drones up until she tries disguising herself as N. People like to say that Sin is essentially holding back and is just playing with her food, but why? Why would someone who has previously been shown as extremely intelligent and manipulative be toying around with the greatest threat to her existence? Shouldn't her priority be to eliminate Uzi so nobody else can challenge her? So yeah, while we could have had Uzi and the others utilize actual strategy to defeat Sin, we instead got a flashy Nightcore fight, where the only intelligent thing anyone does is Uzi predicting where Sin teleports. On that note, Sin straight up just isn't as intelligent in this episode as she was in the previous ones. Even though she is a one-note character with next to no motivation outside of wanting to consume all life, part of what made her captivating was how she'd manipulate her opponents into letting their guard down before getting the drop on them. Here she's just a brutish monster who relentlessly hunts down our main characters, rather than exploiting their weaknesses, like N's love for Uzi or the fact Sin can literally remote control her, which, by the way, is something that this episode just does not understand at all. This leads into the next section, plot holes and retcons. It's shown to us in the previous episodes that the Solver can take control of drones, and certain types of intense emotions are able to break its control over them. The humans studying the Solver never discovered this, and it would have been far too situational to rely on even if they did. So they developed a patch to sever Nori and Yeva's connection to Sin. So now, explain to me how Uzi is able to completely nullify Sin's control. Is it because she's angsty? If so, why wasn't Nori able to nullify Sin's control like her daughter could? I'm genuinely confused how this whole control system works now, because Uzi basically just saying "nuh-uh" completely throws a wrench in everything and undermines the entire conflict of episodes 6 and 7 and Nori's backstory, which also consequently undermines a major plot point, that being the extinction of the humans on Copper 9 due to the core collapse, which can't happen if Sin can't control Nori, meaning that she never meets Khan and Uzi is never born. You could have literally just had N or Nori stab the Solver-possessed Uzi with the patch at the end of the fight scene, rather than destroying it, and this wouldn't be an issue. Hell, you could have brought it back in this episode and have N use it to free Jay from Sin's control as well. Episodes 6 and 7 were both produced alongside each other, so there's no reason they couldn't have put this in other than lazy writing. On the topic of the Solver itself, we should also discuss how Sin's fate at the end of the episode fundamentally breaks the continuity of the entire series. So at the climax of the final battle, once Uzi has Sin's core in her grasp and tears it out of her chest, she then proceeds to blow a hole in the planet itself and uses the sunlight to disintegrate her core. Instead of this killing Sin like it would with any other Solver host, it causes her core to turn into a black hole, and rather than Uzi just kicking Sin's body down the pit they were standing above, throwing the black hole down there, or even just crushing in her grasp, she does the most stupid thing possible and just eats it. And if you thought the setup was bad, it only gets worse from here. In episode 7 we learned that the Solver drone consuming another Solver drone's core results in them inheriting their abilities. Here, however, Uzi not only gains Sin's abilities, but her consciousness itself merges with her own, and now they both share the same body. I already stated this before in our collab video on the Solver and Andrew's channel, but I need to make this abundantly clear. Solver drones being able to merge is a blatant lore contradiction for the sake of forcing a plot twist, as it was never shown to have happened on the 3 separate occasions in which Solver drones were killed by other machines before episode 8. When Dahl was killed by Sin, when Yeva was killed by V, and when all the cores in the oven and the disassembly drones were killed by the Sentinels. This begs the question, why haven't we seen merged drones in this series before? What was stopping Dahl from merging with Sin, Yeva from merging with V, or the test subjects in Cabin Fever Labs merging with the other drones in their vicinity, or even the Sentinels themselves? What about all the cores in the oven that got eaten by one of them in episode 6? Why couldn't they merge with it? I'll tell you why. The writers didn't want to permanently kill Sin, so they had to cheat the established rules to keep her alive. If we applied episode 8's logic to those test subjects and the MD cores, then there would have been multiple machines running around with merged consciousnesses before Uzi was even born. If it was that easy for the Solver to revive dead drones in that manner, the staff of the labs may have never even gotten to the point of developing the patch, or even giving Nori and Yeva the Solver in the first place, throwing the entirety of the plot and future events of the series into uncertainty. Also keep in mind how Sin outright says the humans kept cutting her feed, and yet Nori and Yeva were the only ones who made it out alive, implying that the Salvor drones were being killed down there and never merged with anyone.
Had my suspicions. Thought they kept cutting my feed.
Merging is something that straight up makes the internal logic of the Salvor not compatible with the continuity of the story itself. This isn't just a plot hole, this completely and utterly destroys the plot of the entire show itself. Why? Because if drones can merge, that means Nori and Yeva never get the patch because the labs are overrun with merged drones and sentinels, the core collapse never happens, Uzi is never born, and the entirety of the show's narrative changes, all because merging is canon. Don't even get me started on what it does to the stakes and conflict of this whole show as well. Because if Salvor drones are completely immortal, that means none of the main characters of the main villain are in any real danger at all, because no matter what happens, they can just merge with whoever killed them and always come back. It's lazy, cheap, and nullifies the conflict of the entire series, all for the sake of a last-minute plot twist. They tried to make Sin immortal and caused the foundation of the entire show to crumble to pieces. Now that the merging rant is out of the way, now we can take a look at the complete and utter disregard of narrative consequences that add up to make this episode a complete failure in terms of storytelling. We've already talked about a few character deaths, be they real or more fake-outs that ultimately have no impact, but there's one we need to discuss in particular: V. Episode 6 went out of its way to tell us that the upper stories of Cabin Fever Labs are a dead zone for drones, the only survivors being Alice and Bew who've been able to keep them locked behind doors. We've seen what happened to entire squads of MDs who went down there unprepared. And V? She's alone, surrounded by machines that could instantly paralyze her through eye contact, and presumably doesn't have an EMP cannon like Jay does. But then somehow she manages to escape unscathed and even tames one of them. If V can just casually waltz out of Cabin Fever Labs, then why are we supposed to believe that Sentinels are highly efficient predators? Bringing her back undermined the conflict of Episode 6 entirely and took away any impact her death could have had on the stakes and narrative. The only thing she does throughout the entirety of Episode 8 is fight and assassinate a Jay, have another hallway scene where she infodumps to N explaining how scared she was of Sin, which, by the way, is never even acknowledged by N and has no consequences for their relationship, before joining Uzi and N to fight Sin and Jay at the end. Outside of fan service, there's no justification for reviving V, or Jay for that matter, given how she does even less than V. Permanently killing them both would have allowed Uzi and N to have more development as well, since they wouldn't be taking up nearly as much screen time. People like to praise this scene where V explains everything that happened as if it's the pinnacle of her arc, and while it does show some character development from her, which is more than what I can say for the other characters in this episode, it ultimately contributes nothing to the actual story, since we already knew she remembered the past and was trying to kill Uzi in episode 4, so Sin would leave her and N alone. If you absolutely needed to bring V back for the finale, give a proper explanation like a flashback of her using an EMP cannon on the Sentinels and escaping, not just showing up in space with one and having a text conversation with Lizzie. Maybe show how V's choices affected her relationship with N. Maybe N doesn't want to date her anymore because of how mean she was to him when they first arrived, and would rather be with Uzi who actually supports him. From that, V would have to face the consequences of her actions that hurt him. A simple interaction like that could have done wonders for both characters, but instead, nothing else happens between them. There's also a lot of destruction in this episode, like an absurd amount of destruction, to the point where I think the previous episode's title would have been more fitting for this one. What's funny is that after the planet was blown open twice over, and had 4 black holes explode on it, it's just magically back together by the episode's conclusion. Not a single named character died here, despite everything that just happened. Drones should be flying off into space left and right, not just falling back to the planet all safe and sound. Oh yeah, for some reason Uzi, N, and even Nori were able to survive re-entry into Copper 9's atmosphere, yet are hurt by sunlight and will literally die if they overheat internally. Even their clothes somehow survived, which honestly, that's probably for the best, knowing how horny the show's fandom can be at times. Okay, so Uzi can summon black hole projectiles and blow up continents now, but when was it ever established she could do that on her own, and to that degree of destruction? Now I might as well just assume that Sin can also summon black holes and blow up planets from a distance, which completely nullifies the conflict of episodes 6 and 7 entirely, since she can just blow up at the labs with one and get to the core much easier. Also, if black holes are that destructive, why does Sin even need to go to the planet's core? Why can't she just sit in the spaceship and throw black holes at Copper 9 until the planet eventually cracks open like an egg? There's genuinely no reason for her to even disguise as Tessa in the first place, if Jay's already fully loyal to her because of how scary she is, along with the fact she could have just easily blown up the planet from a distance. Also funny how V somehow knows Tessa was Sin, when she had never even seen her without the spacesuit on up until the hallway scene, and the fact she literally held a blade up to Sin's throat in episode 6, as if she thought it actually was Tessa, and not the very thing she and Jay were so scared of. If V knew Tessa was Sin all along, why not take advantage of the fact she's literally surrounded by machines that could instantly paralyze her? Like seriously, just let Sparky shoot her or smash Sin's helmet open and force her to make direct eye contact with the Sentinels. And if you can't rely on the Sentinels, just attack Sin while her guard's down. All you would need to do is aim for her core and just plunge your claws or nanite acid into her upper torso, or even just use the laser thing to just slice her core in half. This is yet another instance of a plot point shown to us in this episode that goes out of its way to undermine the narrative of the previous ones. Again, this wouldn't be an issue if V believes Sin actually was Tessa. It's as simple as changing her lines from Tessa is Sin to Sin followed us here, and V would have had no reason to even attempt to assassinate Sin in episode 6. Oh yeah, Uzi and Sin merging at the end of the episode basically destroyed any and all stakes and conflict of the entire series. We also see Doll's ghost in the credits scene, which basically confirms that Solver drones can canonically survive without their cores now. This means that pretty much every single Solver or disassembly drone death that has happened or could potentially happen means nothing now, since whoever dies can just merge with whoever killed them and always come back. Cool! Good to know this episode undermined everything that came before it. In case you lost track of all the damage that's been done to this show's narrative in this episode alone, I'll list them all here. Copper 9's intact again. Doll's just a ghost floating in the background that doesn't do anything. We have V coming back from the dead, only the info dump about how Sin forced her to keep the truth hidden from men, and their relationship never develops beyond that. Jay's potential and character was completely assassinated, only to make another character look more imposing. The entirety of episodes 5, 6, and 7 are now rendered completely obsolete and meaningless, and nothing meaningful happened in them anymore. Sin is somehow back from the dead, has merged with Uzi, and is once again in full control of her body, even though it was shown she could nullify it earlier. To sum it all up, Absolute End fails as a finale because it doesn't have an ending for the story the whole show is trying to tell, and because of that, it completely falls apart when looked at through a critical lens. The only reason this episode had any positive reception from the fandom at all was because of the abundant amount of fan service injected into it to the point of overdosing, and its flashy animation and visuals. It's funny how people rip into big budget studios over-relying on fan service and flashy visuals, but when an indie animation studio does the exact same thing and wastes the precious money they need to make shows like this, nobody bats an eye. It's apparent they were trying to curb stomp the life out of the series and end it as quickly as humanly possible, and couldn't be bothered to refine the final episode's script, resulting in this heap of brain-dead, colorful, and passionless slop being the show's conclusion. The very first episode of this series proved that we didn't need flashy visuals to get invested, and unlike this finale, took the time to show its world and characters instead of trying to rush straight towards the end. It wasn't perfect by any means, but it was clearly well written enough to allow the entire series to even happen in the first place, and good writing is all it would have needed moving forward. Instead of desecrating your own work and reducing it into refined slop to feed the masses, how about you take the time to ensure it's actually well written before you decide to blow the US government's budget on it? This series deserved a better ending. In order to accomplish that, all it would have needed is better writing.